You may have arrived here out of curiosity, or perhaps something stirred within you at the mention of the word empath. If so, understand this. We are not gathered simply to discuss sensitivity or sentimentality. No, we meet to explore the ancient undercurrents beneath what the modern world casually calls feelings. When I speak of the empath, I do not refer to someone who merely mirrors others' emotions. I speak of a psychic channel, a conduit, through which the unconscious forces of the world flow. This, I assure you, is no simple blessing. Empathy, in its widely embraced form, is often celebrated. Yet we must be cautious of any idea that has been too easily digested by the masses. Popularity often comes at the cost of depth. The empath I've come to understand through dreams, therapeutic work, and archetypal insight is not a cheerful, spiritual cartoon. The true empath carries burdens, often those not their own, and is frequently unaware of the forces that move through them. To truly comprehend this, we must look deeper beyond the personal and even the interpersonal. The empath is not merely attuned to others on a psychological level. They are unconsciously open to the archetypal forces shaping those around them. Picture a village healer in a time of turmoil, kneeling in a field, coughing blood, not because they are ill, but because the land itself is. That is the empath. They transform what is not theirs to own. They feel pain that was never meant for them. And if they do not recognize this role, they may be consumed by it. I once dreamt long, before I had language for these archetypes, of a woman standing on a bridge over a dark chasm. She had no eyes. Her hands reached forward, trembling, seeking help, perhaps, or trying to ward something off. Below her were countless voices, filled with sorrow, longing, confusion. Though she could not see them, she felt them. Each cry left a mark on her body. That woman is the empath, not blind in sight, but blind to the source of her pain. She cannot tell where others' suffering ends and her own begins. She is the sponge, yet no one has taught her how to wring herself dry. To remain open without wisdom is dangerous. The unconscious has no inherent morality. It is both divine and chaotic. When an empath absorbs another's psychic material, whether through compassion or sheer energetic openness, they take in that person's unprocessed shadows. And most people walk the earth trailing long neglected shadows, unseen, unloved, and feared. What remains unloved in one person often seeks shelter in another. The unaware empath becomes that shelter. I recall a tale from African tribal lore, a story I encountered during my studies. It tells of a young dreamer who walked near the forest and heard the cries of nameless spirits. These beings spoke not in words, but in waves of emotion, grief, fear, longing. The dreamer began to cry at random, tremble in stillness, laugh without cause. Concerned, the tribe feared possession and summoned an elder. But the elder did not drive the spirits away. Instead, he taught the dreamer to speak to them, to name them. That is the lesson I share with you now. To be an empath without discernment is to become a vessel for cast-off archetypes. But the empath who learns to name what they carry embarks on the path of transformation of alchemy. It is not enough to say, I feel what others feel. You must go further. Why do you feel it? Where does it enter you? What do you do with it? Because empathy can become a quiet possession. The unconscious is deceptive. It doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it arrives as overwhelming compassion. That drowns you. Sometimes it shows up as a compulsive need to help, to the detriment of your own boundaries. And sometimes it appears as love for someone whose shadow has attached itself to your soul, mistaking your body for its burial ground. I have seen empaths fall deeply for those who slowly destroy them, not out of frailty, but because they were unknowingly drawn in by that person's pain. They felt the ache, and in doing so, became the caretaker, the rescuer, the silent absorber. But this leads to a dark reversal, what I've called enantiodromia, where a gift turns into its opposite. The healer becomes the harmed. The light bearer becomes host to another's shadow. As this unconscious exchange continues, the empath begins to lose connection to who they truly are. If you are an empath, know this. Your gift is not merely emotional, it is psychic and archetypal. You are attuned not only to feelings, but to the vast currents that shape the collective human experience. When someone enters your space, you don't just perceive their smile or tears. You sense their ancestry, their hidden gods, their unlived stories. And unless you've made contact with your own unconscious, unless you've journeyed through the shadows of your own psyche, you risk being overwhelmed. There is a tendency in spiritual circles to romanticize sensitivity, to treat it as a badge of honor. But in the realm of the soul, no gift shines without casting a shadow. Empathy, perhaps more than any other trait, brings that shadow to the surface. Do you know what happens when someone suppresses rage for years? It doesn't vanish, it waits. It lingers in the psychic field. And when such a person meets an empath, especially one unaware of their own buried anger, that rage can leap across like fire to dry wood. The empath, unaware, may feel irritated, oppressed, inflamed, without knowing they are carrying a fire that is not their own. I once worked with a woman who wept the moment she entered my office, before saying a single word. At first, she believed her pain came from her family, her partners, her life. And yes, wounds were there. But over time, we uncovered something deeper. She was carrying generations of unwept sorrow from her mother, grandmother, and the women who came before, each of whom had been forbidden to cry. She had become the vessel for a collective grief, and in doing so, had lost touch with her own voice. Empaths, if you do not learn to separate what is yours from what is not, you risk drowning in a sea of nameless ghosts. The ability to feel is sacred, but sacredness requires structure. The vessel must be strong enough to hold what it contains. Contain the fire, lest it consumes you. There's another vision I feel compelled to share. A man stands inside a cathedral made of mirrors. Each step he takes, unfamiliar voices echo through the space. He turns toward a mirror, expecting to see himself, but instead, he sees a weeping child. Another mirror now, a screaming soldier, then a dying mother. Each face stares back, unfamiliar, unrecognizable. He begins to cry out, "Which one is me?" But the mirrors remain silent. They only reflect. This too is the empath lost in the mirrored inner lives of others. Unable to recall the face they once wore before, they absorbed everyone else's pain. If this resonates with you, ask yourself, what have I truly done to know myself? Not in affirmations or identity labels, but in the fire of real confrontation. Have you dared to walk through your own underworld and speak to your shadow? Have you recognized the parts of yourself that use empathy to feel important, needed, even virtuous? Have you acknowledged the quiet satisfaction that sometimes comes from being the only one who understands another's pain? Yes, even empaths are not free from shadow motives. Sometimes, helping others is a distraction from facing oneself. Sometimes, carrying everyone else's wounds feels easier than confronting the silence of our own. We are complex beings. We dress up our avoidance as virtue. And the unconscious, ever cunning, smiles behind the mask. Empathy is not redemption. It is a doorway. And to pass through it wisely, we must master boundaries, not rigid defenses, but permeable, wise limits set by a soul that knows itself. To say, I feel your pain, but I do not become it. To say, I see your wound, but I will not carry it inside me. To say, I bring presence, not possession. That, I believe, is the true calling, not to absorb others, but to witness them. There is no greater tragedy for an empath than to disappear within the pain of others, until their own soul becomes a whisper. And yet, it happens in marriages, where one partner silently carries the emotional weight of both. In families, where the most sensitive child becomes the household's emotional anchor. In therapists, teachers, and spiritual leaders who confuse compassion with self-erasure. This confusion is not harmless. It is archetypal possession. An empath, without the grounding of self-work, becomes overtaken by the wounded healer archetype, also known in myth as Chiron. When Chiron surfaces unexamined, it turns suffering into purpose. You start to believe you're meant to hurt, that your worth lies in your ability to bear pain, even on behalf of others. But this is distortion. It is not the transformative pain of growth, but the endless loop of unconsciously serving others' wounds. The empath begins to lose autonomy, not out of compassion, but because the archetype now leads. Understand this. Archetypes are not mere symbols. They are living psychic patterns older than words, older than civilization. When you feel compelled to help, when exhaustion follows you after entering a room, when being needed feels like elation, pause. These may not be your feelings alone. They may be the voices of archetypes moving through you. The savior. The martyr. The mother. The seducer. Each can quietly animate the unconscious empath, moving them like puppets pulled by invisible cords. But puppets do not become whole. They perform. To truly individuate, the empath must engage in the brave, sacred act of separation. Not from love but from enmeshment, not from care but from fusion. This is not indifference. It is warmth with integrity. To stand before another's pain and say, I will not leave you, but I will not bleed for you. To feel the surge of another's grief and say, I will sit beside you, but I will not become the ocean. One image returns to me now, a dream shared by a patient. A forest ancient, tangled, its roots stretching like fingers through time. At its center, a deep stone well. Around it, empaths sit, hands pressed over hearts, weeping. Inside the well, the shadows of their loved ones. The empaths peer in, hoping that with enough sorrow, enough care, they might lift those shadows into the light. But the well has no bottom. And their tears only nourish it. This, too, is the peril of compulsive empathy. It feeds the very darkness it seeks to heal. There is a truth few dare to admit. Not everyone wants healing. Not every soul is ready for awakening. And the empath who confuses their gift with obligation will spend their life trying to rescue the unwilling, only to be dragged down themselves. Ask yourself, does your empathy free, or does it bind? Does it respect others' journeys, or override them with your own urgency? Even healing can become control when driven by fear. There are parents whose empathy becomes suffocation. Lovers whose sensitivity becomes a tool of manipulation. Friends whose compassion masks a fear of being forgotten. All of this is the shadow. There is a side of empathy where care becomes currency and emotion becomes power. You may recoil at this idea. Not me, you might say. But if you're truly empathic, you must turn that awareness inward. Ask yourself, where has my gift become a disguise? Where do I mistake connection for obligation? Where have I made myself indispensable to others as a way to avoid being alone with myself? This is not a judgment, it is the path to integration. True empathy is not about absorbing another's pain. It's about witnessing it without losing your grounding. It is the ability to stand in the fire of someone else's suffering and not be consumed by it, not through detachment, but through a strong connection to the self. And what is the self? It is the full expression of who you are, not just your feelings or your light, but your shadow, instincts, past, and potential. Self is not an abstract idea, it is the living core of your psyche, around which inner archetypes orbit like planets. When the empath finds this center, they are no longer overly porous. They become rooted, and from that place, real compassion flows. Not as sacrifice, but as strength. But this journey is not simple. It requires descent. The empath must venture into the depths of their own psyche. They must face the parts of themselves that feel validated by being needed, that fear abandonment so deeply they lose themselves in others, that confuse intimacy with enmeshment. These are not defects. They are survival responses formed from early wounds, often in childhood times when sensitivity was either punished or exploited. Have worked with patients whose empathy was born from trauma. A young girl who learned to read her father's mood to avoid his rage. A boy who became finely tuned to his mother's sadness, lifting her spirits with a joke or a hug. These children didn't become empaths through spiritual insight, but through necessity. And that necessity carved into them a kind of hypervigilance they later mistook for a gift. Yet a gift rooted in fear must be refined. You must ask yourself, who was I before I was taught to prioritize others' feelings? What part of me still believes love must involve suffering? What would happen if I stopped absorbing everyone else's pain? Who would I become and would I still be loved? These aren't theoretical questions. They are thresholds of transformation. And it's here that the empath faces their real challenge. To feel and remain whole. To open their heart while keeping their backbone. To love without losing themselves. To help without becoming hollow. To witness suffering without being defined by it. This is not detachment. It is mastery. Let me offer a final image for now, though many others come to mind. A woman stands before a fire. In her hands, a bowl. Around her, chaos, a storm rages, voices cry out, winds scream, scenes of pain and injustice swirl overhead. But she does not flinch. She lowers the bowl to the earth inside, her own tears. She kneels and whispers not to the storm, but to herself. I feel you, but I am not you. And in that moment, the storm begins to settle. Not because she absorbed it, but because she stopped resisting her own sovereignty. This is the true empath, not the sponge, but the vessel, not the martyr, but the mystic, not the savior, but the mirror. The deeper we move into the archetypal terrain of the empath, the more we enter the world of dreams. For it is there that their gift begins to reveal itself, free from the censorship of the ego. The dream realm does not flatter. It does not romanticize empathy the way culture does. It shows it in its raw, primal, symbolic, alchemical form. I once worked with a thoughtful young man who identified as an empath. When he entered a room, he felt an unseen weight pressing into his chest. He couldn't rest when others were in pain, and he was growing weary, as though his soul were fading into everyone else's narratives. He didn't come to me for insight. He came because he feared he was vanishing. He shared a dream. He stood at the entrance of a cave. Inside, screams echoed. Faces of those he'd loved and lost drifted through the dark, each calling his name. A child clung to his leg. A man bled at his feet. A woman, pale as ash, reached toward him. He tried to flee, but couldn't move. Then from deep within the cave came a voice, not a scream, but a whisper. You made this your temple. I told him that line wasn't metaphor. It was a message from his unconscious. He had constructed a psychic shrine from pain. He had confused suffering with purpose. In trying to heal the world, he had turned himself into a sanctuary for every lost soul. But the spirit cannot flourish in a temple made of ghosts. Dreams often reveal what we avoid in waking life. And for the empath, they show the unspoken deals we make with pain. If I suffer with them, they'll feel less alone. If I take in their rage, they won't explode. If I disappear, they'll finally have space to breathe. But the unconscious does not reward martyrdom. It calls for truth, for balance, for confronting the self-doubt. So, The empath, if they are ready, must reclaim what they've given away, not to become selfish, but to become whole. Here, the path of individuation begins. Individuation is the process of becoming fully oneself, not a mask, not a reflection, not a patchwork of traumas or projections, but a complete, integrated being. For the empath, this journey starts not with others, but with the forgotten parts of themselves, parts they exiled in favor of tending to everyone else's feelings. They must descend into their own caves. Ask themselves, what is my anger trying to teach me? What is my grief concealing? What part of me is attached to being the wounded one? And even more challenging, what part of me is drawn to rescuing the wounded in others? This is not easy work. It breaks illusions. It dismantles the heroic identity of the empath and uncovers the deeper wounds beneath the healer's mask. It calls them to stop bleeding on altars never meant for them. And it asks them to take the most courageous step of all letting go. Let's begin. Others experience their own pain. Let me be clear, empathy, when conscious, is sacred. But when it is unconscious, it becomes a form of contamination. It blurs energetic boundaries and floods the self with emotional residue that does not belong to us. And that residue often runs deeper than we might imagine. In many empaths, we discover inherited sensitivity, ancestral entanglement, passed down like an heirloom. What was once sacred can now feel burdensome. A woman whose great-grandmother served as a village medium may feel overwhelmed in modern crowds without knowing why. A man descended from ancestors persecuted for witchcraft may carry a silent guilt about his intuitive gifts, burying them beneath intense emotional responses rather than using them skillfully. Empathy, in such cases, carries ancestral grief, long echo of unresolved sorrow, seeking a voice in a sensitive descendant. And unless that descendant wakes up and chooses to feel with awareness, they become another vessel of unconscious repetition. These people often have dreams filled with deep archetypal symbols, serpents coiling around the heart, oceans swallowing, children, ancestral homes in flames, while the dreamer stands helpless. These aren't just personal symbols, they are messages from the deep psyche saying, "You are holding what isn't yours." I remember one patient, an artist deeply attuned to beauty, pain, and rhythm. She had a recurring dream, walking through an old museum surrounded by sculptures of people she knew, parents, lovers, friends. Each had a plaque, "Do not touch," property of the dead, and yet she touched them, and they bled. I told her this dream wasn't punishment, it was guidance. Her empathy had become necromantic, a constant reaching into the past, trying to feel what no longer belongs in the present. She didn't need less feeling, she needed discernment. Some pain is sacred to witness. Some is meant to be laid to rest. Unconscious. Empaths become gravediggers for collective pain. They walk the psychic battlefield, mistaking every wounded figure for someone they must save. But not all suffering wants healing. Some suffering seeks completion, an end. To interfere with that is to play God in a realm we don't fully understand. So, what do? Harden our hearts? Turn away from the hurting to protect ourselves until we're numb? No, we refine our empathy. We transform it from sponge to sword, from open wound to clear reflection, from martyrdom to mysticism. A true empath isn't fragile. A true empath is initiated. They've entered the shadow realms and claimed their own pain. They've faced their unmet needs. They've spoken with their rage, shame, and fear. And because of that, they no longer confuse empathy with entanglement. They can feel without collapsing, witness without absorbing, love without losing themselves. And from that place, their gift evolves. It becomes not a burden, but a beacon. They illuminate without burning. They guide without dragging. They offer presence, not rescue, Most importantly, they remember, it's not their job to carry the world. Their responsibility is to carry themselves with such integrity that the world remembers how to carry itself. This is the threshold, not of despair, but of transformation, that everything said so far, everything unearthed from your inner depths now, calls for one thing: not admiration, not analysis, but embodiment. The empath who has faced the darkness within does not emerge as a broken healer or eternal sponge, but as something rarer, a living, conscious presence, a vessel who knows that empathy is not absorption. It is alchemy. It is the fire through which suffering is honored, not own witnessed, not inherited, transformed, not stolen. When the empath becomes conscious, they no longer scan rooms for pain to fix. They enter as mirrors, not reflecting wounds, but reminding others of their forgotten wholeness. They become what I call the wounded mystic, not because they still bleed, but because their scars now speak of survival, a return from the unconscious, bearing wisdom. But even here, there, is a subtle danger. With empowerment comes another archetype, the magician, the one who has seen through illusion, who understands energetic exchange, who can face another's shadow without fear. Yet if this magician loses humility, they believe they are above suffering. Seduced by insight, they turn wisdom into a weapon. Empathy becomes manipulation, and the cycle begins again, this time more cleverly disguised. So beware. Initiation is not a trophy. It is a lifelong responsibility. To be a conscious empath is to wake up every day asking, is this mine? Am I feeling or fusing? Am I healing or controlling? Am I present or performing? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs of growth. The conscious empath does not fear uncertainty. They don't rush to fix or soothe. They allow silence. They let others be broken without rushing in to save them. They trust the intelligence of the soul, knowing that sometimes pain is not the enemy, it is the threshold. And what of relationships? Here too, everything shifts. The unconscious empath is drawn to the wounded, the chaotic, the narcissistic, not out of ignorance, but because a part of them still believes love must be earned through endurance. They are pulled to those who reflect their unhealed inner child, the one who learned that love comes only through suffering. But the conscious empath seeks clarity. They gravitate toward those who see them, not just need them. They build relationships based on truth, not trauma. And when loneliness comes, they do not fill it with the ghosts of others' brokenness. They sit with it. They listen. They let the silence speak. Here, the empath reclaims their gift not as a vessel for pain, but as a revealer of soul. They no longer dim their insight to keep others comfortable. They don't twist their boundaries to avoid being left. They know that saying no is not rejection. It is protection of something sacred within. I once dreamt of a still, silver lake. Along its shore stood people I had known, students, patients, even versions of myself. Each looked into the lake, searching for answers. And in the center stood a single figure, untouched by ripple or wind. They spoke no words. They simply were. And everyone who met their gaze saw not their pain, not their needs, but who they could become. This, I believe, is the calling of the awakened empath, to be a mirror not for suffering, but for potential, to walk not as a martyr, but as a reminder, to feel not everything, but only what is true, to carry not the weight of the world, but the frequency of integrity. In doing so, they don't abandon the path of feeling. They evolve it. They transmute it. They become what alchemy has always pointed toward, the fusion of opposites, the heart and the spine, the open hand and the rooted self, the healer and the human. So if you recognize yourself in these words, if your dreams have shown signs of overgiving, emotional hunger, sacred exhaustion, then take this not as judgment, but as invitation Step back from shadows that are not yours. Turn inward. Face the silence you've avoided. Speak with the parts of you that merge to survive. Honor them. Thank them. Then let them go. You are not a sponge. You are not a sacrifice. You are not broken for the comfort of others. You are a living threshold, a place where energy becomes meaning. A space where pain is acknowledged, not consumed. Where empathy becomes wisdom. And if you can hold this subtle clarity, this gentle flame, then you won't just survive your sensitivity. You will sanctify it. You will walk among the ghosts of the world and remain unhaunted. You will feel without falling, witness pain without performing penance. And above all, you will return to yourself, not as a rescuer, but as a soul.